2,075 kilometers. That is the distance from Easter Island to the nearest inhabited land. Pitcairn Island, 50 people, a volcanic outcrop in the South Pacific that most of the world has never thought about. The nearest continent is more than twice that far. South America, 3,512 kilometers east. Chile's capital, Santiago, is 3,700 kilometers away. Stand on the cliffs of this island and look in any direction. In every direction, for as far as the eye will carry, there is only water. No inhabited island in the world is more remote than this one. And yet, someone found it. More than 1,000 years ago, someone launched a canoe into the open Pacific. Not by accident, not by drift, but with intention, and navigated to a speck of volcanic rock smaller than the 5 boroughs of New York City. They brought chickens, sweet potatoes, seeds, dogs, the things you bring when you plan to stay. They built a civilization here, entirely alone, for 6 centuries before any European ship appeared on the horizon. And what they built, in that absolute isolation, was unlike anything else on Earth. 887 stone giants, the tallest nearly 10 meters high, each one the carved face of an ancestor. Each one moved, somehow, across miles of volcanic terrain, without wheels, without draft animals, without anything the standard assumption of human capability should have allowed. By the time European ships arrived in 1722, something had changed. Many of the statues lay face down in the earth. The palm forest that had once covered the island was gone. The population was a fraction of what it had been at its peak. The world looked at those fallen stones and drew a conclusion. Easter Island was a warning. A civilization that consumed its own resources, built bigger and bigger monuments in a runaway escalation until the ecosystem failed and the people collapsed with it. A parable about the price of ambition without restraint. The parable is not the whole story. The Rapa Nui, the people who built these statues, survived for 600 years in the most isolated, inhabited place on Earth. They invented farming techniques for volcanic soil that modern agronomists still study. They navigated open ocean without instruments of any kind. They developed one of only a handful of original writing systems in the history of human civilization. They did not simply destroy themselves, something destroyed them, and it arrived from the sea. On April 5th, 1722, it was Easter Sunday. Jacob Roggeveen was 62 years old. Dutch, sailing for the Dutch West India Company on a voyage meant to find the great southern continent that European geographers had long insisted must exist somewhere in the Pacific, a landmass to counterbalance the weight of the northern hemisphere. He had been at sea for nearly a year. His lookout spotted something on the horizon, an island, unmapped, not on any chart he carried. He altered course. April 5th, Easter Sunday. He named it Pash Island, Easter Island. In his journal, Roggeveen described what he saw when his 3 ships drew close to the coast. A green island, fires burning on the shore, people coming down to the water, and along the coast, standing on raised stone platforms, enormous statues, facing inland, watching over the land behind them, a row of giants no European had ever imagined. He wrote, and his words have been translated many times since. We could not comprehend how it was possible that these people, who are destitute of heavy, thick timber for making any machines, as well as strong ropes, nevertheless had been able to erect such images, which were fully 30 feet tall. He was wrong about the timber. He was wrong about the ropes. But he was not wrong about the scale. What happened in the days that followed was also recorded. On one of the mornings in that first week, his crew believed they were being robbed. A misunderstanding about what was being given and what was being taken. His sailors opened fire into the crowd gathered on shore. 10 to 12 Rapa Nui died in the initial volley. The first Europeans to see this civilization arrived, fired their guns, wrote in their journals that the statues were magnificent, and left within a week. They brought no sustained contact, no trade, no sustained curiosity. They left a handful of dead and a name that was not the island's own. The Rapa Nui had a name for their island before Roggeveen gave it one. Tepito o Tehenua, the navel of the world. In their cosmology, the island was not at the edge of existence. It was at the center of it. The ocean that surrounded them in every direction was not an obstacle. It was the medium through which the world existed. To navigate it was not to travel from one place to another. It was to move through the fabric of everything there was. The oral tradition of the Rapa Nui names the leader of the founding voyage, Hotu Matua, the Great Parent. He came from a place called Hiva. Scholars have debated for more than a century whether Hiva corresponds to the Marquesas Islands, the Gambia Archipelago, or somewhere else in central Polynesia. The genetic evidence, refined over the last 2 decades, points to eastern Polynesia, most likely the Marquesas, roughly 3,500 kilometers to the northwest. Hotu Matua did not arrive by accident. Polynesian wayfinders, the navigators who crossed the Pacific in outrigger canoes over several centuries, operated without instruments of any kind that Europeans would have recognized. They read the night sky. They memorized star paths. They felt the long swells that move beneath the surface of the Pacific, rolling thousands of kilometers from distant weather systems, bending around islands in patterns that a trained wayfinder could read with their hands trailing in the water. They watched the flight paths of birds. They noted the color of the sea, different over different depths, over different seafloor, near different coastlines. They read cloud formations that form over land masses too small to see. They found Easter Island on purpose. The island they found was not the island that exists today. Pollen cores drilled from the sediment layers beneath the island's crater lakes tell the story of what was here before human arrival. The island was densely forested. The dominant species was Pascalococos disperta, an enormous endemic palm, probably the largest palm tree that has ever lived, related to the Chilean wine palm. It grew to perhaps 30 meters. Its trunk alone could have been 2 meters across at the base. The island also supported Toromiro trees, the small, twisted tree that would later become the wood of choice for carving rongo-rongo tablets, and hau-hau, a tree whose bark could be twisted into rope. There was ground cover. There were land birds. There were seabirds nesting everywhere, undisturbed. In numbers, the arriving settlers would have found extraordinary. The arriving Rapa Nui would have looked out on something like a garden. Anakina Beach, on the northern coast, is where the tradition says Hotu Matua made landfall. It remains the only white sand beach on the island, a crescent of pale coral and shell sand sheltered by the curve of the coast. To arrive here after weeks at sea, to feel the sand instead of the volcanic black rock that lines most of the shoreline, it would have felt like confirmation, like the island was waiting. The archaeological evidence at Anakina, chicken bones, coconut shells, carbon-dated sediment, places the earliest occupation at roughly 800 CE. The settlement grew slowly at first, then faster. Over the next 3 centuries, the Rapa Nui fanned out across the island, and as they spread, they began to build. On the southeastern slope of the extinct volcano, Rano Raraku, there is a hillside that does not behave like a hillside. From a distance, in the right light, it looks like a field of enormous heads. 60, 70 faces emerging from the earth, buried to the chin, some to the shoulders, staring outward with that specific expression the moai always carry. Not quite impassive, not quite commanding, something between the two. These are not complete statues. These are the ones that never left. Rano Raraku is the quarry. This is where 95% of all the moai on Easter Island were carved. The volcanic tuff of this hillside, a compressed layer of ash from an eruption long before human arrival, proved to be the perfect medium. Dense enough to hold a carved surface, soft enough to work with basalt picks. The carvers worked in teams. They began with the face, then the ears, then the arms folded across the chest, then the back. When the statue was nearly complete, they undercut the base and let it slide down the slope to the platform below, where the final details, the eyes, the pukao top knot of red scoria, would be added. Joanne van Tilburg has spent more than 40 years cataloguing the moai of Easter Island. She began in 1982, working with the Easter Island Statue Project, and she has now documented more than 887 individual statues. Every finished moai, every fragment, every abandoned figure still embedded in the rock. In 2023, her excavation team, working in the dried sediment of Rano Raraku's inner lake, made a discovery that changed the interpretation of the quarry's purpose. Moai buried not in the slope, but in the lake bed itself, surrounded by evidence of offerings. The quarry was not only a workshop, it was also a sacred site. The statues were placed near fresh water because fresh water, on a volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific, was itself sacred. But the detail of Rano Raraku that stays with every visitor is not the finished statues. It is El Gigante. Still embedded in the upper slope, unfinished, never extracted, is the largest moai ever attempted. 21.6 meters long, roughly 270 tons. If it had ever been completed and stood upright, it would have been taller than a 7-story building. It was never finished. No one knows exactly why. There is something in the quarry that the facts alone cannot account for. Walk the slope and count the abandoned figures. Begun, progressed to varying stages, then simply stopped. Not broken, not damaged, just left. Picks set down. No evidence of a struggle or a catastrophe, just an absence where a decision should be. Whatever stopped the work at Rano stopped it everywhere, all at once, sometime around 1500 CE. The last moai was never walked to its platform. The last platform was never finished. The ceremony of erection simply ceased. How did the Rapa Nui move them? For 2 centuries after European contact, the assumption was that log rollers carried the moai across the island, that the statues were laid on their backs or sides and rolled over a road of felled trees. This explanation was satisfying because it explained the deforestation. You couldn't move 60-ton statues without cutting down every tree in sight. But the Rapa Nui oral tradition said something different. The tradition said the moai walked. In 2012, Joanne van Tilburg partnered with archaeologist Terry Hunt to test whether this was possible. They built a replica moai, 4.35 meters tall, 5 tons, and attached 3 ropes, 2 at the corners of the base, 1 at the upper back. 18 people. A careful, rocking motion, leaning the statue forward onto one corner, pulling left, then right, then left. A controlled wobble, like a person walking in thick boots on ice. The statue moved. It moved at a rate of roughly 100 meters per 15 minutes. The technique left the same parallel groove marks in the soil that archaeologists had found on the ancient roads of Easter Island. The moai walked, upright, without felling a single tree. This does not mean the deforestation didn't happen. It happened. But its primary cause was not the moai. It was farming, and rats, and time. Every September, a bird returns. The sooty tern, called the manutara by the Rapa Nui, breeds on Motu Nui, a small islet visible from the cliffs 300 meters above the sea. It is one of the Pacific's great travelers, capable of flying for years without landing, sleeping on the wing above open water. It may go 3, 4, 5 years between landings on solid ground. But every September, it comes back to the same rock. The manutara is a medium-sized seabird, black above, white below, with a forked tail and a call that carries a long distance across open water. It nests in dense colonies, laying a single egg on bare rock. Its return is not metaphor, it is biology. But for nearly 300 years, the return of the manutara was also the most politically important event in Easter Island's calendar, the first egg of the season. Whoever retrieved it first would determine who held power for the year. The Birdman competition, the Tangata Manu ceremony, required competitors, or their chosen champions, to climb down the 300-meter sea cliff at Orongo, swim through shark-frequented water to Motu Nui, wait on the islet for the manutara to lay, retrieve the first egg without breaking it, tie it to their forehead, swim back through the current, climb the cliff, and present the egg intact to the priests above. The winner's patron became the Tangata Manu, the Birdman, the sacred ruler of the island for the year that followed. This competition replaced an earlier political order, the hereditary chieftain system based on the mana of the ancestor statues. After that system broke down, sometime around 1500 CE, it was an active political reinvention. The Rapa Nui, facing a changing world, built a new system of governance from the symbols their island offered. The manutara did not know this. It simply came back, the way it had always come back, the way it still comes back today. The moai were not simply statues. Understanding what they were requires setting aside every assumption that the word statue carries. The moai were not decorative. They were not monuments to power in the way a pharaoh's obelisk is a monument to power. They were not objects of worship. They were the ancestors themselves. In the cosmology of the Rapa Nui, the dead did not leave. They remained present in the world, embedded in the landscape, capable of channeling mana, a force that could mean spiritual authority, vitality, luck, protection. The ancestor you carved into stone became a conduit. The mana of a revered chief, fixed in basalt and tuff, could continue to bless the land, protect the crops, and guide the living for centuries after death. The moai were erected on ahu, raised stone ceremonial platforms built along the coastline, facing inland toward the people who had built them. They did not watch the sea. They watched over the fields, the villages, the descendants who needed their protection. The eyes were open. In 1978, a young Rapa Nui archaeologist named Sergio Rapu was excavating near one of the island's ahu when his team uncovered fragments of white coral and red scoria, not from the platform itself, but from the debris field in front of it. He fit the pieces together. White coral carved to the shape of an eye socket, a disc of red scoria for the iris. The moai had eyes. They were not the blank stone faces that had stared at the world for 2 centuries of European contact. When standing, when newly erected, the moai had white eyes with deep red pupils looking outward over the land. The gaze was specific, intentional, seeing. Over 3 centuries, roughly 1200 to 1500 CE, the moai grew larger. The platforms grew more elaborate. More workers were required. More food had to be produced to feed those workers. The social organization required to feed, coordinate, and house a workforce capable of carving and transporting a 40-ton statue was significant. But this was not mindless competition. Archaeologists who study the distribution of ahu around the island's coastline note that they are evenly spaced, roughly every 3 to 4 kilometers, in a pattern that suggests deliberate territorial allocation rather than competitive one-upmanship. Every major lineage group had roughly equal access to the coast. Every major group had its own ahu. The moai system was not the product of irrational escalation. It was a complex, functioning political and religious infrastructure that distributed prestige, territory, and spiritual authority across the entire community. It worked. For 3 centuries, it worked. On the island's southeastern coast, below the slopes of Rano Raraku, stands the largest ahu ever built on Easter Island. Ahu Tongariki, 15 moai on a single platform. The shortest is 4 meters. The tallest is nearly 9. One of them still wears its pukao, the red scoria top knot, carved separately from the body at the quarry of Punapau, and lifted to the head with a technique that still isn't fully understood. On the morning of May 22, 1960, an earthquake struck the coast of Chile. Magnitude 9.5, the largest earthquake ever recorded in human history. The shockwave moved across the Pacific at the speed of a jet aircraft. When the tsunami reached Easter Island, the wave was estimated at 10 meters. It lifted the 15 moai of Tongariki, some of them weighing up to 86 tons, and threw them inland. Some were found 150 meters from the platform. The platform itself was destroyed, the carefully fitted basalt blocks scattered across the coastal plain. The statues that had survived centuries of internal conflict, the deliberate toppling of the Ahu wars, the indifference of European contact, lay broken in the grass, face down, their heads separated from their bodies. It took 30 years before anyone attempted to restore them. In 1992, a Chilean-Japanese joint project began what would become a 4-year effort to re-erect the 15 moai of Tongariki. A Japanese crane manufacturer named Tadano donated the machinery. Chilean archaeologist Claudio Cristino led the excavation and reconstruction. Stone by stone, moai by moai, the Ahu was rebuilt. By 1996, all 15 stood again. In the island's interior, 7 moai stand on a platform called Ahu Akivi. They are the only moai on the island that face the sea. Every other Ahu, every other set of ancestors, faces inland, watching over the living. These 7 face west, over the Pacific, in the direction from which the island's founders came. They were also placed with astronomical precision. At the spring equinox, the setting sun aligns directly with the faces of the 7 figures. At the autumn equinox, the full moon rises directly behind them. The Rapa Nui, who built Ahu Akivi, were not simply orienting statues toward home. They were anchoring the ancestors to the calendar of the sky. They were saying, "We know exactly where we are, and we know exactly where we came from. And these 2 things together are who we are." The Rapa Nui oral tradition holds that dolphins guided the first canoes across the open Pacific. Whether they did is beyond recovery now. But the spinner dolphin, the tonina, still moves through the waters surrounding Easter Island in pods of 20, 30, 50 animals. They are visible from the cliff edge. Arcing above the surface, the tail walk, the sideways fall, the behavior that gave the species its name, visible from 300 meters above on a clear morning. Stenella longirostris, the spinner dolphin. Roughly 2 meters long, gray above, paler below, a dark stripe running from eye to flipper. It is one of the most acrobatic cetaceans in the Pacific, capable of 7 full rotations in a single leap before returning to the surface. The precise purpose of the spinning behavior is not fully understood. Communication, perhaps? Parasite removal. Play, if play is a concept that applies to animals this far from human observation. They travel in groups that operate on what appear to be shared decision-making protocols. The direction of a pod's movement shifts based on the majority orientation of individuals within it, a kind of fluid democracy of the body. The same species, the same waters, the same behavior that the first navigators watched from the bow of a canoe, trying to understand what the ocean ahead of them contained. The moai have fallen and been re-erected. The palm forest has come and gone. The population has collapsed from thousands to 100 and risen again. The Rapa Nui language has nearly died twice and has been revived twice. The spinner dolphins have not noticed any of this. They follow the same currents they have always followed around the same island, through the same deep blue water as they did 1,000 years before any human being arrived. 300 meters above the sea, on the rim of the volcanic crater Rano Kau, there is a village unlike any other on the island. Orongo. 53 stone houses, each one barely large enough to lie down in, built with walls of overlapping horizontal slabs and roofs of the same. Corbelled construction, like the inside of an igloo translated into stone. No windows, doors low enough that entry requires crawling. The walls pressing close on both sides. These were not houses for living in. They were houses for ceremony. The view from Orongo is one of the most singular on the island. Behind, the caldera of Rano Kau, a 300-meter-deep volcanic crater filled with a freshwater lake, rings of totora reeds floating on its dark surface, a place that feels unchanged since before human arrival. Ahead, the cliff edge, the 300-meter drop to the sea, and beyond it, 1.5 kilometers out, the three islets, Motu Nui, Motu Iti, Motu Kau Kau, where the Manutara nested. The walls of Orongo are covered in petroglyphs, hundreds of carved figures overlapping each other across centuries of repeated carving, most of them showing the same image. A figure with a human body and a bird's head, crouching, holding an egg. The Tangata Manu, the Birdman. The Birdman competition replaced the moai system as the island's primary political institution sometime around 1500 CE, the same period when moai construction stopped, when many of the ahu were toppled, when the obsidian spear tips began appearing in the archaeological record in significant numbers. Something broke down. The moai were not toppled by natural disaster. They were toppled by people. The evidence is unambiguous. The statues were pushed from the front, deliberately, with the intent of landing them face down in the earth, the worst possible desecration of an ancestor figure, the negation of its mana, the final insult to a defeated lineage. Ahu was smashed. The eyes were removed and scattered. The careful geometry of the platforms was demolished stone by stone. This was not ecological collapse. This was civil war. And out of the wreckage, the Rapa Nui built something new. The Birdman system was not a retreat. It was a reinvention, a democratic competition, or something approaching democracy, in that the outcome was determined by physical accomplishment rather than hereditary right alone, that gave every lineage group the possibility of holding power. The chief whose Hopu Manu first retrieved the Manutara egg held the island's political authority for the following year. Then, the competition ran again. It worked. For roughly 300 years, from approximately 1500 to 1800 CE, the Birdman system governed Easter Island. The green sea turtle has been swimming through these waters longer than this island has existed. Chelonia midas. The Honu in the Rapa Nui language. One of the Pacific's oldest living forms, a species whose ancestors predate the dinosaurs, whose body plan has not changed in 100 million years. The island itself formed roughly 3 million years ago, pushed up from the seafloor by volcanic activity. The turtle was already here, passing through, following currents that the island merely interrupted. The green sea turtle grows to 1.5 meters and can live for more than 80 years. It navigates across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, from feeding grounds to nesting beaches, using the Earth's magnetic field as a map, detecting variations in field intensity and angle that allow it to locate a specific beach on a specific island within an error margin of a few kilometers after years at sea. It returns to the beach where it was born to lay its own eggs. Every time, across decades, the same sand, the same cove, an accuracy that human navigation didn't reliably achieve until the 20th century. The Rapa Nui carved the honu everywhere, on the basalt walls of Orongo's ceremonial houses, on the flat rocks above the ocean at Anakai Tangata Cave, on the loose stones of the island's interior. The turtle appears in the petroglyphic record more than almost any other image, a visual vocabulary of reverence for a creature that could navigate 3,500 kilometers of open ocean and return home. The Rapa Nui knew this about the turtle long before Western science had instruments to understand it. They watched it arrive and leave and arrive again, season after season, century after century. They understood, without the equations, that the turtle carried a map of the world inside itself. Anakina Beach remains a nesting site. At night, in the right season, the honu still comes ashore there, still following whatever magnetic memory draws it back to the place it has always come. Jacob Roggeveen was not the last. In 1770, a Spanish expedition commanded by Captain Felipe Gonzalez arrived from Peru. He was more systematic than Roggeveen. He landed, he stayed long enough to claim the island for the Spanish crown, planting 3 crosses on the highest points and drawing up a formal document of possession. He asked the Rapa Nui to sign it. They signed it in Rongorongo. 4 years later, in 1774, Captain James Cook arrived. Cook found a different island than Roggeveen had described. He noted that the moai along the coast had been toppled, most of them face down. He noted that the population appeared smaller than accounts from earlier visits had suggested. He noted that the people seemed thin. His descriptions of the island and its people are careful and detailed and carry a specific register of concern. Cook was one of the most observant travelers in European history. He knew, when he arrived at Easter Island, that he was seeing a place in the middle of something. He left after 3 days. In 1805, an American sealing vessel called the Nancy took 22 Rapa Nui men and 10 women off the island by force, intending to use them to hunt seals on the Masafuera Islands. 3 days out, the men were released from irons so they could cook. They leapt into the sea and swam. The captain tried to recover them, but the current was running. He left them. He continued with the 10 women. The names of the women on that ship are not recorded anywhere. By the early 20th century, Easter Island was a sheep ranch. In 1888, the Chilean government had annexed the island, a formal ceremony with a flag and a document that the Rapa Nui leadership signed, under the understanding that they were entering into an alliance that preserved their sovereignty. They were not. They were ceding. Within 9 years, the Chilean government had leased the island to a merchant named Enrique Merlet, who sublet it to the Scottish commercial firm Williamson Balfour and Company. The Rapa Nui were confined to the town of Hangaroa, roughly 10% of their own island. The rest was given over to 70,000 sheep. They required identity papers to move. They required authorization to leave the island entirely. This lasted 65 years. In 1914, a British archaeologist arrived. Catherine Routledge was 48 years old, wealthy enough to fund her own expedition, unconventional enough to have earned a degree from Oxford, at a time when Oxford did not formally award degrees to women. She and her husband William had spent 3 years building a 90-foot schooner in Scotland, specifically for the purpose of reaching Easter Island. She stayed 17 months. She was methodical, patient, and increasingly aware that she was racing against time. The oldest Rapa Nui alive in 1914 had been born after the catastrophe that would be described in the climax of this documentary. Their memories were of aftermath, of a diminished island, of elders who had died without transmitting what they knew, of tablets no one could read anymore. Routledge interviewed everyone who held any fragment of memory. She documented the ahu, the moai, the Birdman petroglyphs at Orongo. She measured and mapped and wrote everything down. She asked about Rongorongo specifically, understanding that the key to its reading would be not the tablets themselves, but a person who had learned the reading tradition directly. She found no such person. The chain had been broken 50 years before she arrived. Her book, The Mystery of Easter Island, published in 1919, remains a foundational document of Easter Island scholarship. The oral accounts she recorded, fragments, partial memories, things half-remembered from grandparents who themselves only partially remembered, are the closest any researcher has come to a first-hand transmission of Rapa Nui knowledge of the moai system and the events of its end. She returned to England. Within a few years of her return, she began to show signs of a mental collapse, paranoia, deteriorating judgment, eventually institutionalization. She spent the last decade of her life in an asylum where she died in 1935. Some of her colleagues attributed it to illness, some to the stress of the expedition. One of her biographers observed simply that she had spent 17 months in one of the most beautiful and most haunted places on Earth, had come as close as any living person to hearing a voice that was gone, and had returned unable to explain what she had found and what she had missed. The only town on Easter Island is Hangaroa. 7,750 people live here today, a number that includes both indigenous Rapa Nui and Chileans who have settled on the island over the past century. The town runs along the western coast, a grid of streets with one main road, a small church, a grocery store, a handful of restaurants, pickup trucks, Wi-Fi, children riding bicycles past a church built on the foundations of a pre-contact ceremonial site. The Rapa Nui language, a Polynesian language unrelated to Spanish, is still spoken here. It is taught in the island's school. Signs are bilingual. Young people code switch between Rapa Nui and Spanish mid-sentence in the way that border languages do everywhere they have survived contact with a dominant tongue. The 111 survivors of the events of the 1860s rebuilt from inside Hangaroa's boundaries. They rebuilt without their king, without their political system, without their writing. From 111 people confined to 10% of their island, restricted by laws that treated them as foreign nationals on their own land, the Rapa Nui population grew. By 1934, 456 people. By 1960, 1,000. Today, roughly 3,000 indigenous Rapa Nui, with more living on the Chilean mainland. In 2022, a new Chilean statute granted the Rapa Nui expanded autonomy over their island, a formal recognition, 134 years after annexation, that the people who have lived on Te Pito o Te Henua for more than 1,000 years have a claim on its governance that precedes and exceeds the Chilean state. The statute is not full self-governance. The conversation about what self-governance would mean continues. The year is 1862. The island's population is somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 people. The Birdman competition is still being held at Orongo. The society that emerged from the civil wars of the 1500s has stabilized. Trade with passing ships has become intermittent but established. Some Rapa Nui have left the island on European vessels and returned with goods and news from the outside world. King Kaimakoi rules. He is the Ariki Mau, the supreme chief, a position still held by hereditary right, the bloodline of Hotu Matua traced across 1,000 years. His son is Marata. His people are the Arioi, the class of knowledge keepers who memorize and recite the Rongo Rongo tablets, who maintain the oral histories, who are the living library of everything the Rapa Nui have ever known. In December 1862, on the horizon to the east, 8 ships appear. They are flying Peruvian flags. They carry fireworks, colored cloth, mirrors, bright objects. The ships anchor in the harbor. The men on board call out in friendliness. They have gifts. They have things to trade. They invite the Rapa Nui to come aboard. How do you recognize danger that has no precedent? The Rapa Nui had experienced European ships before. Some had been violent, some had been beneficial, most had been neutral. A ship in the harbor with gifts and fireworks and men speaking in friendly tones. There was no pattern in their experience that would identify this as the kind of threat it was. They came aboard. The hatches locked. The ships were Peruvian slavers. They operated with the tacit permission of the Peruvian government, which had recently banned the African slave trade under international pressure and now required a new labor supply for the guano industry. The Chincha Islands, off the coast of Peru, held enormous deposits of seabird guano, the most effective fertilizer in the world at that time, essential to the agricultural revolution that was feeding a growing global population. Extracting it required a workforce willing to dig for it. No one was willing to dig for it, so a workforce was taken. The ships worked the coasts of Polynesia and Melanesia for months. Easter Island, the most isolated inhabited island on Earth, was the last stop on a circuit that had already filled most of the holds. On this island, the labor of deception was particularly efficient. The Rapa Nui came to the ships in numbers. Approximately 1,500 people were loaded below decks. King Kaimakoi was among them. His son Marata was among them. The Arioi, the readers of Rongo Rongo, the custodians of the island's written memory, were among them. Half the island's population was at sea before any alarm could be raised. The Chincha Islands lie 21 kilometers off the coast of Peru. They are 3 small, barren rocks rising from the Pacific, covered in a layer of seabird guano that in the 19th century had accumulated to a depth of 50 meters. The smell carries for several kilometers at sea. No one who visits the islands by choice. No trees, no fresh water, no soil, only rock and guano, and the men digging it out. The work was brutal by any measure used in the 19th century. The Rapa Nui sent to the Chinchas were not laborers. They were the governing class and the intellectual class of their civilization. King Kaimakoi was a man of ceremony, of lineage, of political authority accumulated over generations. The Arioi were the island's scholars, its archivists, the people who could hold a Rongo Rongo tablet and read what was carved on it. They were dressed in the island's finest cloth when they boarded the Peruvian ships, adorned for what they believed was a ceremony. They were given pics. Of the 1,500 Rapa Nui taken in December 1862, the vast majority were dead within months. Disease, smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery moved through people who had lived in near total isolation for more than 1,000 years, with no immunity to almost anything the Eurasian disease pool contained. King Kaimakoi died somewhere on the Chincha Islands, probably in early 1863. The records are incomplete. His name appears in one document acknowledging that a Rapa Nui king had died in Peruvian custody. No further detail, no cause of death given, no burial recorded. His son, Marata, died within weeks of his father. The Bishop of Tahiti, Tapano Jausen, who had actually been given Rongo-Rongo tablets by Rapa Nui converts and was in the middle of attempting to decipher them, wrote a series of increasingly furious letters to the Peruvian government. French diplomatic pressure joined his protests. Eventually, a Peruvian public that had not been told what the ships were doing in the first place turned against the enterprise. In 1863, Peru agreed to repatriate the surviving Rapa Nui. Of 1,500 taken, 15 were still alive when the repatriation ships were loaded. They sailed west. Of the 15 who boarded the repatriation ship, at least 9 died during the voyage. 6, perhaps 7, reached Easter Island. They brought smallpox. The word moves too quickly through a page. To understand it, you have to slow down. The Rapa Nui who had remained on Easter Island, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people, depending on the estimate, had no immunity whatsoever to smallpox. None. Their isolation had protected them from every epidemic disease that had swept through the Pacific over the previous century. They had not been exposed to measles, influenza, tuberculosis, or smallpox in any generation anyone alive could remember. The 6 survivors arrived home. They were welcomed back. They had been gone more than a year. Their families embraced them. The epidemic that followed killed between 60 and 90% of the remaining population within 2 years. By 1877, just 15 years after the December night when the Peruvian ships appeared on the horizon, 111 people were alive on Easter Island. 111. On a 163 square kilometer island that had once, at its height, supported thousands, that had built 887 stone ancestors, that had navigated to the most isolated inhabited point on Earth on purpose, that had invented a writing system, that had governed itself for 1,000 years. 111 people. King Kaimakoi had 3 grandchildren among the 111. The royal line, the unbroken descent from Hotu Matua across 1,000 years of Pacific habitation, passed to them. The Arioi who could read Rongo-Rongo were gone. The systematic oral transmission of the island's history was gone. The political system of both the Moai era and the Birdman era had been severed at its source. The civilization that had built and governed and mourned and adapted and rebuilt over 10 centuries had been reduced to 111 survivors in 15 years. Not by moai, not by deforestation, not by the choices the Rapa Nui themselves made, by 8 ships from Peru. It is called Hoa Hakananaya. The name means approximately hidden or stolen friend. It is carved from basalt, not the soft volcanic tuff of most moai, which is why its surface still carries detail that the coastal statues have long since lost. It stands 2.42 meters tall. Its face is the clearest, sharpest, most specific face on any moai in the world. Its back is covered in Birdman petroglyphs. Hoa Hakananaya was taken from Orongo in 1868 by the crew of HMS Topaz, a British Royal Navy corvette that stopped at Easter Island on a surveying voyage. The ship's captain, Richard Powell, arranged for the statue to be removed from the ceremonial village and loaded into the hold. The Rapa Nui present at the time are documented as being distressed by this. Captain Powell's report describes the operation with the enthusiasm of a collector who has acquired something valuable. The statue was presented to Queen Victoria. She donated it to the British Museum. It has been in London ever since. In 2018, the governor of Easter Island, Tarita Alakon Rapu, wrote a formal letter to the British Museum requesting the return of Hoa Hakananaya. She accompanied it with a hand-woven crown and a personal appeal. She described the statue not as an artifact of cultural heritage, but as a living presence, a member of the community, a sacred object whose removal was an act of dispossession, not curation. The British Museum has not returned it. In their official response, the museum noted that under the British Museum Act of 1963, they are legally prohibited from deaccessioning any object in their collection, even if the object was acquired under circumstances that would today be considered theft. A law passed in 1963, applied to a statue taken in 1868 from a community that had just watched half its people carried away on slave ships, that had 111 living members, that had no mechanism to object and no government to advocate for them. The British Museum receives roughly 6 million visitors a year. Hoa Hakananaya stands in room 24, visible to anyone who wishes to see it. It is one of the institution's most important objects. In Hangaroa, the MAPSE, the Rapa Nui Museum, holds casts of the missing moai and the original objects that remain. It is a good museum. It is a museum of absence as much as presence, carefully labeled spaces where things that were taken are represented by their descriptions. Hoa Hakananaya is not the only Easter Island artifact in European collections. The Louvre holds objects. Edinburgh's Royal Scottish Academy holds pieces from Routledge's expedition. The Smithsonian holds material. The world's museums collectively hold more of Easter Island's cultural heritage than Easter Island does. The question of who owns what and what ownership means when applied to a civilization's relationship to its own ancestors does not have a clean answer. The British Museum is not evil. It is also not releasing what it holds. Below the surface of the water surrounding Easter Island, something is building. Easter Island sits in some of the clearest, most isolated ocean water on Earth, remote from runoff, from agricultural chemicals, from the sediment of major rivers. The water here has a transparency that marine biologists describe as exceptional. Visibility of 60 meters is common. In the right conditions, 70. Below that water, at depths between 3 and 30 meters, coral polyps are building the island's reef. A coral polyp is a small animal, related to jellyfish and sea anemones, a tube of tissue with a mouth and tentacles at one end. A hard calcium carbonate skeleton it secretes around itself at the other. It is roughly the size of a grain of rice. It lives in colonies of thousands, sometimes millions, interlocked structures growing at the rate of approximately 1 centimeter per year. 1 centimeter per year. The coral reef that currently surrounds Easter Island is, by that measure, a record of time that exceeds the island's human habitation many times over. It grew while the Rapa Nui arrived and built and carved and quarried. It grew while the palm forest fell. It grew while the Peruvian ships came and went. It grew while 111 people sat in, Hangaroa, and tried to remember what they had been. The reef did not notice any of it. It simply built, the way it has always built, in the clear, dark water below the cliffs where the moai are watching, 1 centimeter at a time, slower than anything human patience can observe, faster than anything human memory can hold. The navel of the world. The Rapa Nui did not name their island modestly. They named it with the understanding that the center of the world is wherever the people who love it most happen to be standing. For a civilization that lived in absolute isolation for 600 years, building 887 ancestors out of volcanic stone, inventing a written language in a place where no written language had ever existed, governing themselves through systems elegant enough to survive the collapse of the first and the invention of the second. The claim was not hubris, it was geography. The parable that Easter Island became, the warning, the cautionary tale, the civilization that destroyed itself, is not a lie. There was environmental stress. There was internal conflict. The palm forest was cut, and the rats ate the future, and the soil eroded, and the civil wars toppled the ancestors. The island did not make it through the 16th and 17th centuries without cost. But the Rapa Nui survived those centuries. They adapted. They invented the Birdman system. They kept building. They kept farming with their careful, lithic mulching in their diminished landscape. They held their island with 111 people and rebuilt from that number to the community that exists today. What ended the civilization of Easter Island as it had existed? What took the king and the scholars and the writing and the political memory was not the decisions the Rapa Nui made about their forest. It was 8 ships on a December horizon. What remains? 887 moai, of which roughly 50 stand on their original platforms. The petroglyphs at Orongo still cut into the basalt. The Birdman figure repeated hundreds of times on walls that have faced the Pacific for 5 centuries. The Rapa Nui language, spoken by roughly 3,000 people worldwide, taught in schools, sung at festivals, written in newspapers. The Tapati Festival every February, the Hakape, the fishing grounds, the lineage of Hotu Matua, carried forward through 111 people. What remains also, 26 rongo-rongo tablets in 10 museums on 4 continents. Unread. Hoa Hakananaya in room 24 of the British Museum. The petition for its return, unanswered. The question of what self-governance means for a people still technically subject to laws written in Santiago. The story of Easter Island is not finished. It was not finished in the 16th century when the moai toppled. It was not finished in the 19th century when the ships came. It is not finished now when a Rapa Nui governor's letter sits in the British Museum's administrative archive, awaiting a response that the law, as written, prevents from being the right one. Tepito o Tehenua is still the navel of the world. The world just hasn't finished deciding what that means. If the questions this island raises interest you about what civilizations leave behind, about what is taken from them, about what survives, subscribe to Where on Earth and join us on the next journey. There are more places like this, misunderstood, remarkable, still here. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next road.